Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast. Most of you listening either have a job or have had a job. Some of you may be managers, some of you may be bosses, entrepreneurs, CEOs. If you want to know real world data regarding how sleep impacts business, job performance, your sleep health, or lack thereof within that context, and perhaps what you can do about it as an individual or as a company to improve that sleep status of your employment or your company, in my mind, there is only one person that you contact. That person is Dr. Chris Barnes. Chris is the renowned Michael G. Foster Endowed Professor of Management at the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. And I would absolutely advise that you follow him on Twitter. You can find him at Chris24Barnes. So that is at Chris24 Barnes. As you're about to see, he is the individual leading the science and the practical implementation of sleep in businesses, in the corporate world, within the workplace. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Now, in this first series with you, I wanted to focus on the employees themselves. And in subsequent episodes, we'll speak about business leaders, entrepreneurs, and entire corporations. What I wanted to start with, maybe at a high level, is a superb scientific paper that you recently published called Why Healthy Sleep is Good for Business. And as you and I know, in working with large companies, there is quite an ingrained, it almost feels sometimes immovable and perhaps even understandable mentality that less sleep equals more productivity. As we're about to find out, it's quite the opposite. So while we'll get into some of the real specifics in terms of individual proof and facts, this is so unfair as a question, but give me the 2-minute elevator pitch that you would offer a large Fortune 500 company, let's say the board of directors, to convince them that sleep is not detrimental to business outcomes. Sleep is markedly beneficial to things like productivity, key performance metrics, and the investment in terms of sleep is absolutely observable within the employee themselves. So, what is the big picture here? Why should anyone thinking about sleep, workplace as a business be concerned?
This is a conversation I have with my MBA students who are many of them going to eventually end up in high-level positions in their organizations. And so I say, okay, think about your work context. Now, there are some work contexts in which decisions are not very important. Product quality is not very important. Behaving ethically, maybe that's not that big of a deal because there's not much room to behave unethically. Teamwork doesn't matter. So in those contexts, we could probably ask those employees to do their jobs, which are probably quite monotonous. We could sort of ask them to do that in their sleep. In essence, that's sort of what we do sometimes, where they're so sleep deprived. It kind of is like asking them to do it in their sleep. So in those contexts, perhaps the cost to productivity from sleep deprivation is not that big of a deal. But in many other contexts, probably most contexts, the quality of the product matters. The decisions that we make matter. Mistakes can be quite costly. They matter. Creativity matters. Behaving ethically matters. Working effectively in teams, that matters. So in those contexts, sleep will have potentially quite powerful effects on the performance and the productivity of employees. So there's a bit of a trade-off here that we tend to ignore, where you can usually get people to work more hours by getting them to sacrifice their sleep, but the quality of their work is going to suffer. And in a lot of contexts, that quality really matters. And getting a little bit more work by making that work a lot worse in quality is usually a bad trade-off to make in those contexts. So really, people who are at high levels in their organizations must ask themselves this question: Does quality matter in our organization? And if it does, then sleep very much matters, and sleep will impact the way those employees behave and perform in their organizations.
I cannot imagine there's anyone listening who has a company, maybe with those few exceptions, that really would not like to see higher quality creativity, productivity coming out of their employees. And yet, that's the case with sleep. I almost liken it to a spin bike class at the gym where when those employees are underslept, everyone looks like they're working hard, but the scenery never changes. There's no forward progression in terms of the business because, as you said, they're on the job, but they're half asleep. We know, and you know very well, that sleep clearly impacts work. But in this paper that I was reading that you recently published about why sleep is good for business, you noted an added twist in that plot. Sleep not only influences work, but of course, work markedly influences someone's sleep. And I think when I'm getting asked these questions about sleep and businesses, it's always with the mindset that it's a one-way street, that it's about how sleep the night before predicts your next day work and performance. What we tend to forget is that your work performance and your environment the day of can have quite a profound impact on your sleep the following night. I think in the paper, you almost, tell me if I'm wrong, outlined sort of four domain categories. Tell me about what you've discovered regarding how your work impacts your sleep at night.
Yeah, so this particular paper was a literature review across a large body of science, which examines not just, as you mentioned, how does sleep influence our work outcomes, but also how does our work influence our sleep. We see in this literature that our lives are interconnected across these domains. And so there are four categories of ways that our work influences our sleep. And these are rich categories with many things in them. But I think we get the big picture idea by talking about these four categories. One is work shift length and timing. So longer shifts tend to come at the cost of sleep. People talk about burning the midnight oil because they're working so much. So sleep is the thing that gets left behind there. And of course, the timing of those shifts. So shift workers in particular are people who live these lives in which they have either shifts that are during sleep hours or hours that are especially well for sleeping, I should say, or maybe they rotate. And so they're experiencing something that's analogous to jet lag. The amount that we work and when we work, that's sort of the first category. The second one is work demands and stress. So we have lots of experiences at work, which lead to anxiety and stress, which are both physiological and psychological experiences. And those don't evaporate when we walk through the door to go home. We carry these home with us and they persist into the evening. They persist into the time in which we are attempting to sleep. And so we see that insomnia would be a common outcome of experiencing heavy work demands and large amounts of stress at work. And those can be caused by many different sources in the workplace, but that's kind of a key mechanism through which they operate. Another is sleep deprioritization, which kind of goes hand in hand with the last one, which is dedication to work. And so in these cases, we see that a lot of times people start focusing so much on work that it bumps it up to the top of their priority list. And then something has to give there. And then oftentimes sleep is the thing that has to give. We have family demands and it's hard to budge on those, especially you imagine someone who has a young child, maybe a baby. That baby's not going to demand less time. So when they're looking for where to get that time, it comes from sleep. And dedication for work would be an internal factor that sort of drives that, right? You're so passionate about the work, you're doing something really important. And so it leads you to maybe work more or live your life in a way which deprioritizes sleep. Or it could come from the workplace itself, right? Maybe you're not that passionate about the work, but the work is designed to take a lot of your hours. I think about junior lawyers as people who experience this and their lives just kind of get eaten up by their work in a way that pushes their sleep out. And so these sort of buckets are the sources of ways that our work can undermine our sleep. And then, of course, that boomerangs right back around, right? So if your work is undermining your sleep, the next day you come back to work with less sleep and you experience negative outcomes at work as well.
In some ways, that's the irony, which is, I think everyone has had that experience. You're sitting at your computer, you didn't have a good night of sleep, or you've not been getting enough sleep, and you've read the first half page of the report that you need to digest. And this is the third time that you've had to read that opening half page because you're just not consuming the information. You're just so tired, you can't get it, which is in some ways, a description of inefficiency. And I often think of sleep almost a little bit like boiling, a pan of water on a stove. Why would you boil that water in twice the time when it's on medium heat versus boiling it in half the time if you just stuck it on high heat? It's high heat that is good sleep the night before. But I also wanted to speak about those last two, sleep deprioritization and dedication to work, because you're right in some ways, as we've moved from a hunter gatherer way of life to an agrarian way of life, sort of farming, agriculture, to then the industrial era, and now into the digital era. One of the things that's happened in those last two is that commute times have increased. People are living further from work. The commute times are longer, meaning that they have to wake up earlier and they're getting home later. And then, just as you said, they've got responsibilities, they've got families. And also, if they don't, sometimes you don't want to give up time with your partner, or you just don't want to give up time where you're watching television or doing whatever you like to do in the evening. And the one thing that gets squeezed like vice grips in the night is this thing called a full night of sleep. I've always thought of that, and now I'm realizing it from the employee decision perspective, whether it's not in their control because they have to commute, they've got family, or they decide to do it that way. Is there also a culture that you've seen where, slow down, Matthew, because that too is a bidirectional relationship? The culture of CEOs, bosses, can force you, even though you want to sleep and you have the chance to sleep, they breed a culture where you are not allowed to sleep enough. Am I sort of a little bit too maniacal in the thought of transferring some of that responsibility elsewhere? Or is it more so it's just the circumstance of the employee?
You're hitting on a key point here. It's easy to blame the individual for making what you and I might say is a bad choice. So you and I would look at their schedule and their behaviors and say, well, the priorities that they have set are going to do harmful things to them, might shorten their lifespan, it might undermine their performance at work, all these bad outcomes from a lack of sleep. And just blame that person and say, well, if they could just make better choices, then their life would be so much better. I can value personal agency to some degree, but we have to appreciate that this is within the context of the rest of their life, within their jobs in which they have responsibilities and they have people with authority over them and organizational cultures which create very strong norms. And violating those norms can come at a pretty heavy cost. You might be on the fast track, and then if you don't follow those norms for working hard and maybe sacrificing sleep, then maybe you're not on the fast track anymore. So I think we have to talk about personal agency to some degree, but we need a bigger space in the conversation than we currently have for these top down effects from workspaces. And we know that CEOs and founders have the strongest effect over the culture of their organizations and the norms which become embedded in those organizations, even long after the founders are gone. Then later on, the executives who are in charge at that time, they've already soaked in some of those same norms and they tend to persist. They help those norms persist over time. We can have desires to sleep more, but if our environments make that really, really difficult to do, then we're going to have limited success in just making these decisions of, I'm going to sleep more, and so let me make that happen.
And we're going to come on later in the podcast to speak a little bit about how you've changed some of that tide with implementing sleep programs to enhance what's going on at night for people in terms of the amount of sleep. And we'll come to that later. But I also wanted to sort of return to that question of sleep and sleep quality. One of the other things I took from your paper, and it maybe touches on the second of your 2 points, which is work demands and stress. It's not just your job, it's the very nature of what you do that can strongly determine how it subsequently hits your sleep hard at night. And you spoke a little bit about stress and anxiety, which we've spoken about before on this show. But you also spoke a little bit about emotional labor and how that can create sleep problems. What does that mean for folks listening, and how should we think about that?
Yeah, emotional labor is something that is baked into many, many jobs. Millions of Americans have to engage in emotional labor as a part of their job. Essentially, what this is within the cultural context of the US, most people can easily complete this sentence. So we'll see how much you've soaked in the American culture here, Matt. Service with a,
A
how would you
smile,
finish that? Exactly. So
which is very
there are
non-British. It's service with a grimace or at least pursed lips.
So a lot of jobs have customer service demands. We call these emotional display rules, where the person who is interfacing with the customer has to show positive emotions. That seems really nice from the perspective of the customer who gets to have these smiling faces that they get to see when they're interacting with your organization. From the perspective of the employee, they have this demand to engage in service with a smile, but they're not always feeling smiley. Sometimes they're just kind of feeling blah. Sometimes they're feeling pretty terrible, but they still have to live up to these emotional display rules. Closing that gap is what we call emotional labor. There are two primary ways to close that gap. One is what we call deep acting, where someone tries to actually change their own underlying emotional experience. And so a classic way to do this would be to distract yourself from whatever is making you feel negative emotions, or maybe think of something that makes you happy, right? Think of your cute puppy or something like that. So that's deep acting. And the benefit of that is it actually does change your emotional experience, although it is effortful to do this. The other is surface acting. So surface acting is where you're feeling negative emotions, but you just put on this fake smile over the top of them. You have not changed your emotional experience, but by putting on this fake display, this creates anxiety and stress and strain because you feel very inauthentic and you feel like you're being forced to do something that you don't actually feel. Neither one of them is great to engage in, but deep acting tends to have fewer negative outcomes than does surface acting, right? The fake smile just really gets at us on an anxiety level, then follows us home, and then can lead to insomnia later that night. We have a paper showing evidence of this. So the same individual on different nights can have more or less insomnia, depending in part on how much emotional labor in the form of surface acting they had to engage in that particular day at work. So more service with a smile when you're not feeling smiley means more insomnia later on that night.
It's funny how sleep is, in some ways, such a revealer of our emotional lives, meaning that the description you offered is one of a powder keg just waiting to go off. Most people have, a degree of control over their emotions. So when they come home at night, they don't go into a rage, etc. But nevertheless, that emotional tenor, that emotional disturbance is still there. And how does it play out? Not in necessarily in your behavior, but boy, will it play out in terms of fragmented sleep, difficulty falling asleep. You wake up, you have anxiety, you're stressed. I just state that for people to look out for and try to think about ways to resolve it.
It can even follow us into our dreams. My colleagues and I have a fun paper from just a few years ago in which we find that when you have a stressful day at work, that stress follows you home, and then your dreams later on that night are more characterized by negative emotions in the dreams. And then you're more likely to wake up the next morning with that persistence of negative emotions. Those dreams and your sleep can be the linking mechanism by which stress from one day bleeds into your emotional experiences the next day as well.
And that fits very well with the experimental evidence. We've done some work in this area with a sort of a model of essentially overnight therapy and dreaming, and how dreaming essentially acts almost as an emotional therapeutic balm, just taking the sharp edges off that. It's almost divorcing the emotion from the memory so that you come back the next day and you don't feel as bad anymore. But certainly when you look at the data, we don't simply for our dreaming experience just rewind the videotape and replay it. We know that doesn't happen. However, the one thing that does run like a red thread narrative from your waking life into your dreaming life is this thing called your emotional concerns. So it fits very well with that. For those who struggle with sleep, one recommendation that I've often offered and I've written about in my book is meditation. Now, up front, I was a complete skeptic. I thought it was all just a little bit, but the data was really strong. So I tried it, and that was 7 years ago. And I've now been meditating for 10 minutes before bed every night. The app that I've been using is called Calm, and I've decided to partner with them here on this podcast. And Calm have agreed to offer a full 40% off its premium subscription service to you, the listener. And to get that 40% off, you can just go to calm.com/Matt Walker. So again, that is calm, CALM.com/Matt Walker to get your 40% off. So give it a try. See what you think. At this point, people have been hearing us saying sleep impacts, and now we're sort of flipping the question again. Rather than your work impacting your sleep, let's come back to sleep impacting your work. Yes, of course it impacts, and people may think, okay, I get that, it's understandable, but could you frame it for people at sort of a high level, and particularly for bosses and CEOs, where there is this stigma around sleep, and maybe it's sort of a bit of a sleep machismo in the workplace, that you can get by on, let's say, 4 or 5 hours a night and not be impaired when you're working during the day? Just high level, if you've got an employee who's sleeping 4 or 5 hours a day and then coming into work the next day, how is their brain in terms of performance? And we know it's impaired, but by how much?
One of my favorite papers ever, a study conducted over in Germany, published right about when I was finishing my PhD program. Really cool research that they conducted. They had a protocol which simulated a relatively common amount of chronic sleep restriction. So they had people come and sleep in their laboratory for 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep. So we think about this. Many people experience 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep. Many people actually experience many, many more nights than 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep. But that was the protocol for this particular study. And they had these participants engage in a relatively simple cognitive task across time, across these 4 nights. And we know that sleep debt accumulates over time. And so perhaps it's not surprising that their performance got worse and worse and worse over the course of these 4 nights. So they plotted that decrement in performance. Then they sent these participants home to go rest out, relax for, I think it was a week or two, had them come back into the sleep laboratory. This time they didn't sleep deprive them. What they did is they had them drink alcohol. So they would have them drink a little bit, do the simple cognitive task again, drink a little more, do the task again. And then again, they plotted their decline across the course of drinking. And what they found was the blood alcohol content. If you look at the similarity between 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep and then decrements due to alcohol consumption, where those lines met was that 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep led people impaired in performance to the same degree as blood alcohol content of 0.05.
Which is
That
essentially being
is
legally drunk.
scarily close to the limit for legally driving after you drink.
What strikes me about that, as a boss or as a CEO, no one is going to stand there and say, you know what, I've got this team or I've got this employee and they are absolutely fantastic. They're drunk all the time. You know, no one says that. But what they will say is that I've got this fantastic employee. They are so dedicated to their work. They probably only sleep about 4 or 5 hours a night. They are just wonderful. But essentially, you're describing the same cognitively impaired person. And I think what that brings us back around to is this issue of sleep having an image problem in the workplace, that we think of people who get sufficient sleep, or even a culture where people are allowed to get sufficient sleep, as being slothful, as being lazy. That's a mistake. So, basic cognitive performance, you're getting close to essentially almost being legally drunk after that scenario. I want to hit on a number of other things just to hammer home the point of how the pinwheel of different capacities of an employee are compromised. Here, I want to speak next about creativity and ingenuity, because they are so commonly touted as two of the key engines that are supposed to drive businesses forward. And beyond those basic brain functions of an employee, things such as attention, concentration, memory, reasoning, good decision making, all of which we know are impacted by a lack of sleep. This higher level set of traits, creativity and ingenuity, they're so desirable. I used to think that they were a fixed trait, that you're either someone who is a creative type or an ingenious type, or you're not. That's just the way we're wired. And we all know those people. What you helped teach me is that that's not always the case. That's not necessarily fixed, because how you sleep as an employee, or how you're allowed to sleep as an employee, impacts the very things of creativity and ingenuity that companies value. Tell us about that.
Maybe not everyone has exactly the same potential to be creative, but if you want to influence the degree to which you can be creative, then sleep is one of the important ingredients for doing that. And we can think about this from a few different angles, from a few different studies in the literature. One way to look at this is how much sleep did I get the night before that I'm doing creative work right now? There's a study from a couple decades ago that examined people who were either sleep deprived or well rested on a task requiring innovative thinking to perform well. So they found that a night of sleep deprivation produced quite a noticeable decrement in their innovation during that task. Maybe a little bit more interesting is to think about, okay, I've been given some sort of difficult task to solve, a challenging problem that requires some sort of creative insight. So from that starting point, how might sleep influence my ability to solve that problem? Well, another study, they examined that very scenario. So they gave people a challenging problem which requires creative insight to solve. It is possible to solve this task, but you have to kind of think well outside the box to do that. And then they allowed, I think it was 12 hours to elapse. So in both of the experimental conditions, the same amount of time elapsed from the time of the presentation of the problem until they were supposed to come up with a solution. But in one of the two groups, people were allowed to get overnight sleep. And that group was especially likely to reach that creative insight. And so probably some of that creativity was happening while they're asleep, but also those creative juices are better able to flow when you're able to get that sleep. A third way to look at this is our ability to evaluate creativity. And so this, I think, brings it closer to what we think of as a typical workplace experience, where an employee brings to you a new idea and says, boss, I had this great new creative idea. I'd love to implement it. And you have to decide, are we going to give a thumbs up to this and we're going to do it, or we're going to pass on this one? And so one form that this takes is opportunity evaluation. So my colleagues and I did a study of this with entrepreneurs. And we found something that I thought was kind of interesting. So across a set of studies, we presented entrepreneurs with multiple potential opportunities, and we asked them to rate these opportunities. Is this a really good opportunity? Is this a bad opportunity? Somewhere in between. And what we found was that for really good opportunities, everyone was able to spot them as good opportunities, or almost anybody. It didn't really vary by how much sleep one had the night before. But that's the easy part, right? If it's a really good idea, maybe you can spot that. Where we did see variance was for the ideas that look good on the surface. But if you dig a little deeper, you can spot the flaws, you can spot the problems. So for those ones, which are actually bad opportunities, they might not look like it, the people who are well rested are more likely to put in that due diligence and put in the thoughts and actually get to that final decision of, oh, you know what? At first glance, I thought it was good, but as I dig deeper, this is actually a bad opportunity. We will lose money if we implement this. But people who are sleep deprived, they were more likely to just engage in that surface level processing and say, yep, that's good. Let's do it. This is a good opportunity. So that creates quite a problem of wasting resources on bad opportunities. So we see that if you want to be creative in the moment, then having slept well the night before helps you. If you want to take some time to think about something and be creative in your solution, then getting some sleep after you've seen the problem helps you. And then when you're evaluating other people's creativity, sleep helps you to find out which are the best opportunities to pursue and which are the ones that you should pass.
I mean, for C-suite leaders, higher level organizational members, I never thought about that third one and how critical it is. A dear friend of mine who's another podcaster, Tim Ferriss, will often interview some amazing venture capitalists. And here, where I live, just outside of Silicon Valley, I've been stupid enough to try and launch several startups and have some ongoing. And to do that, you have to go and present to what are called venture capitalists, where you present your business idea and you ask for their financial backing, and they will give you like a seed round, or if you're at the next level, they'll give you the next round of money. And so you're going there to pitch your idea of the business. I'd never thought about the implications for them regarding their sleep. This is, by the way, this is genius. Next time I have a startup idea and I say, if you reject me, it's not because it's a bad idea. It's because none of you have been sleeping well and you just missed the biggest opportunity. But the reason I bring Tim's podcast up is he's very clever. One of the things he asked them is to say, yes, you've had these big wins. You went for Uber very early on. You went for Facebook. But tell me about your big misses. And these are the things that they often find more painful, not the big wins and the big hits, But this notion of missing something that they look back on and regret, and it's Daniel Kahneman's work that a loss of $1 can feel twice as bad as the positive feeling of gaining $1, called loss aversion. I've got nothing meaningful to say other than I just find that fascinating. So we've spoken about brain function, we've spoken about attention, concentration, being legally drunk, we've spoken about creativity. I think if you were to ask most people to say, what is one of the biggest stresses or one of the biggest problems with your work or with your company, they don't necessarily say, oh, it's about these very cold cognition. It's all about the social experience. It's the emotional interactions with other human beings that often cause the greatest emotional problem we have. Not that, it's challenging to do that report, or, I'm really struggling to comprehend this information. What most people struggle with is social interaction. And you have spoken huge amount and done some great work in this area of, it's not just about sleep and your performance, it's also about sleep and your social behavior. Help me and unpack in any way that you like how a lack of sleep impacts sort of social behavior in the workplace. And I know there's a lot and we can get to more of this, but tell me a bit more about that.
There's a very rich scientific literature about sleep and social behavior, which of course you're a contributor to. For me, the interesting angle that I've tried to contribute to is to take that and sort of apply it to work contexts. How does sleep deprivation or insomnia, how does this influence the way in which people interact in the workplace? Not just how they feel about each other, but actually how they behave towards each other, towards others as well. We know from a large literature that when people are sleep deprived, that their emotions get worse. So we know it makes them more irritable, more grumpy, maybe more depressed. And we know that their emotions get a lot more variable as well. So we have less emotional control when we are sleep deprived or suffering poor sleep quality. This means that people are often more emotionally reactive. So we talk about making mountains out of molehills. Those sorts of things are especially common when you're sleep deprived, and something that maybe would have been a minor insult, or maybe even not an insult, but maybe just an ambiguous statement. That's a lot easier to turn into a major interpersonal conflict when you're sleep deprived. We see this in lots of other contexts as well. Amy Gordon at the University of Michigan has a really neat program of research on sleep and relationship quality, relationship satisfaction in romantic couples. We see similar things play out. So if we apply this to the work context, it shouldn't be surprising then that when you're sleep deprived, this is going to harm your interactions with customers. It's going to harm your interactions with your coworkers. And so in my research, we find that people are less helpful towards their coworkers when they are sleep deprived. And one of the underlying factors is that because their sleep deprivation or poor sleep quality, because that makes them grumpier and worse moods in general, they're less satisfied with their job because our emotions color the way we evaluate things. Even though their job hasn't changed, because their sleep has changed, they like their job less. And because they like their job less, they're less willing to invest extra effort to help their colleagues. We see some other negative behaviors that come out when people are sleep deprived as well. We can see this in the form of cyber incivility or abuse of supervision, which maybe we'll get to in a bit more detail later on. But generally speaking, when people are not getting the sleep that they need, not getting good, healthy sleep that they need, they're going to be worse employees at their jobs, but they're also going to be worse team members. They're going to be worse leaders. They're going to be worse followers. And so all of those interactions with other people, which are required for so many different types of jobs, are going to be more problematic. And so even if we were able to preserve their ability to do their job when they're sleep deprived, those other things where their actions bleed over into how other people do their jobs, that would still be undermined by sleep deprivation.
I think that is probably one of the most underestimated carcinogenic impacts of sleep in the workplace. And so that's why I'm so glad you got to speak about it. It's almost that notion of I just snapped ... And those words are often words that come out of someone who just was not well slept. And as you said, they went off the handle, they overreacted. You mentioned, and here we're speaking about social behaviors, but there's almost a collision of cognitive brain performance and your social brain regarding two of the factors you've spoken about. One is something called work procrastination, which is hopefully largely self explanatory, but then something else that I'd never heard about before called cyber loafing. Tell me about those two concepts more generally, just so listeners understand them, and then how sleep affects each one of those.
There's some similarity in these concepts and in the research behind them as well. So I have a colleague, Jana Kunel, who works over in Germany, and she has a really cool paper that shows that when employees are sleep deprived, that they're more likely to procrastinate at work, right? So they put off the difficult tasks, the important tasks, in favor of something else other than the difficult, unpleasant thing that needs to be done. So it's maybe not surprised that people do that more when they're sleep deprived. In one of my papers, my colleagues and I examined cyber loafing, which is, I guess, a more specific version of that. So cyber loafing is when you're on the clock, right? You're paid to be working. This is paid work time. And instead of doing the task that you're supposed to be doing for the organization, you are instead maybe watching some funny TikTok videos, you're checking your personal email, you're playing fantasy football, something like that, that is not work related and which is computer mediated. That's the sort of the cyber part of that construct. So across a few different studies, we find that when people don't get enough sleep or when they get poor quality sleep, they're more likely to engage in higher levels of cyber loafing. Those behaviors that the bosses are trying to eliminate because they're seen as lost work time, those tend to creep up more and more when people are sleep deprived. So cyber loafing gets kind of a bad rap. And I can see why people see cyber loafing as a bad thing because it does cut into productivity. But I think we should be a little bit more forgiving of cyber loafing in that people are not just only engaging in cyber loafing because they're bad employees or they hate their job. That certainly happens, but that's not 100% of cyber loafing. Some of that cyber loafing is people who are poorly rested, sleep deprived, having a hard time concentrating. They're trying to do demanding cognitive work and they just can't keep that up as long as if they are rested. So they are using cyber loafing as a break, as a way to recapture some of that lost energy so they can get back to the grindstone. I think we can have a nuanced view about whether cyber loafing is good or bad, but we do know that that tends to go up when people are sleep deprived.
And I'm sure as a boss or a manager, sort of you're walking around the floor and an employee doesn't see you and you walk past them and you see them, on Facebook or on Instagram. It's probably pretty disheartening for both parties. And because one is caught red-handed, the other is just, wow, I thought they were, engaged employee. I can well imagine why that's tricky. Let me shift gears a little bit. We've been speaking about how insufficiently slept employees start to fall apart. But as a reality check for just bosses and managers and CEOs out there, do you know what percentage of individuals typically fall asleep at work and how regularly that is as a barometer of the epidemic of insufficiency of sleep within the workplace?
Yeah, so there was a large scale nationally representative poll conducted by the National Sleep Foundation that published back in 2011. They found that 29% of respondents indicated that in the past month, they had experienced either extreme sleepiness at work or had even fallen asleep at work. That's a quite a scary number, or at least a lot higher than probably a lot of people would expect.
So essentially, he's saying that a third of people in your workplace or a third of people that you walk past on the street going to work will have fallen either asleep or be in some kind of sleepy stupor state at their desks. It's
So
non-trivial.
that might not happen to them every day, but over a 1 month time span, that that large of a portion of the population will have that kind of experience.
Uh, moving from that and understanding that, yes, cyberloafing and procrastination, cyberloafing, which I presume also means that then you're riding the coattails of other people's hard work and it doesn't really breed a good atmosphere of everyone pulling their own weight. A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker, which is a service that comes out to your home and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is going on inside of you. Hence the name Inside Tracker. They look at your blood, your metabolic signals, your hormonal health metrics, and then they give you a personalized, actionable set of lifestyle changes in response to that readout. And the goal there is to improve your health. I was looking and informed they have some new cardiovascular and new hormonal biomarkers that I'm particularly interested in. One that I'm focused on is something called ApoB, which is an absolutely critical heart health measure. And I get it done now with them somewhere between 4 to 6 times a year. Why? Well, my family unfortunately has a strong history of cardiovascular disease. So I am checking that pretty ruthlessly. And by the way, I do buy the product myself out of pocket. I don't want to fall prey to any of those trappings and undue incentives. Although, with full admission, I still use my own discount code that you can use to get some money off. And that code for you is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. So just go over to insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. And again, if you want to get that discount, it is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Thanks very much. Companies perhaps may be then even more concerned about something else you've examined, a worrisome thing. And it can be a very costly thing, both for the employees. That's the concept of moral behavior. I again thought here that your moral awareness and your moral choices were just essentially a trait. You're more so a moral person or less so a moral person. Here again, not quite so much, because sleep is a significant factor that can alter that, particularly within the workplace. Speaking about unethical behavior, everyone is familiar now with the notion of business, particularly on Wall Street, and the Bernie Madoff scandal of unethical behavior. Tell me about what you've learned regarding how a lack of sleep can lead to an employee being a more immoral human being in the workplace.
Well, I'd say, Matt, you're in good company in that.
Are you
I
saying
think
I'm immoral? That's who have you been speaking to? And I'm going to tell you that they are basically telling you the truth.
in that the majority of the history of the research literature on ethics has sort of focused on how some people are good and some people are bad. And so then the question is, how did those good people become good and how did the bad people become bad? I have a paper and some other papers have replicated similar results, indicating that the same person can be more ethical or less ethical on different days. And sleep is one predictor of that variance for a few reasons. One is moral awareness. And so we have a paper indicating that when people are sleep deprived, they're less likely to see that there's a moral issue at stake in the decision they're about to make. Sometimes it's really apparent that there's a moral decision. Should we give this person this life-saving drug, even though they don't have any money? You can talk about the moral aspect of that, and you can maybe argue both sides, whatever your proclivity, but it's pretty obvious that there's a moral component to that. There are other situations in which there's obviously not a moral component to it, right? Which shirt should I wear today? But there's a lot of gray area in between those 2 points. We live a lot of our lives in that gray area. And when we are sleep deprived, perhaps because we put in less cognitive processing in a lot of our decisions, we're less likely to spot the fact that there is something with moral implications in this decision that we're making. And so then we don't engage our moral frameworks to help us to make the right choice in that situation. The other is that when we talk about unethical behavior, oftentimes it's a context in which there is a temptation that should be resisted. You know what is the right thing to do. Maybe you don't really want to do that right thing, but you know that it is the right thing to do. And so you're willing to exert that self-control to overcome those temptations and avoid that unethical behavior. So we do this many, many times in our lives, and the workplace is no different, right? We can lie on our expense reports, we can cut corners, we can blame other people for our mistakes. Lots of different ways in which we can behave unethically in the workplace. And in many of those cases, there's some personal benefit to doing so. So there's a temptation, but most of the time we're able to exert self-control to overcome that temptation and avoid that behavior. Unfortunately, there is some really compelling physiological research to indicate that when we are sleep deprived, our ability to exert self-control is undermined, in part because using self-control relies especially heavily on the prefrontal cortex. And when we are sleep deprived, there's some imaging studies that indicate that the functioning in the prefrontal cortex is more disproportionately impaired than it is in some other regions of the brain. And so in my research, we find that when people are sleep deprived, because they have less self-control to overcome those temptations, they're actually more likely to engage in that behavior. And so in one of the studies in our 2011 paper, that's a multi-study paper, we find that the same person is more likely or less likely to engage in unethical behavior on different days, and that sleep duration and sleep quality are both important predictors of that daily variance.
It's fascinating. And two things come to my mind. First, in terms of the legality of this, and let's say someone transgresses significantly in an immoral way, and then it becomes a legal case and there's a court case, you could imagine, and maybe even myself, I don't know, I'm now trying to check my own emotions. If someone came to the defense of the individual who transgressed and said, look, it's sort of mea non culpa, it's not their fault because you can see from their sleep tracker data that they had only slept in the week before that on average about 3.5 hours a night for whatever reason. And therefore, their brain, not themselves, but their brain was not capable of holding up their normal moral fabric. And so it had distorted the magnetic north of the moral compass. And is that part of a legal defense? Now, at first, I think a lot of people would say, oh, come on, really? That doesn't feel like a fair defense. But you could imagine if someone said, there's this person who transgressed and they were immoral, but we've discovered that there's a part of their brain that was damaged and has been damaged and is not functioning well. It's a part of the brain called the frontal lobe, which you just described, takes a nosedive like a dart into the ground when you're sleep deprived. And therefore, that becomes neurologically objective evidence that they had less volitional control over their acts. And so you kind of think, well, how are those two really different? So nothing to say there, but I do think it's interesting from that perspective. The other thing you mentioned was, I think, an example earlier of doctors. And we know that doctors and medical staff in general are some of the most sleep deprived. Just have to think about residency. And you can think about the moral ethics of how you act towards a patient, the decisions that you make. And these are life and death decisions. There's a great study from my colleague, Anat Perry, recently from Israel, and they were studying physicians and they were tracking their sleep. They were looking at how they treated their patients who were in pain, who needed pain medication. And they found that the more sleep deprived that they were, the less empathetically sensitive they were, the less they would offer the correct prescription of pain medication to alleviate their suffering, which you could see as an act of being immoral, but they're because they're sleep deprived. So there's so many different ways that this plays out, which then brings me on to the question of risk mitigation and if it's possible. Because for those people, if I have an appendicitis at 4 a.m. in the morning, my appendix bursts, then I am very grateful that there are doctors and nurses and medical teams there to save my life. So sometimes it's unavoidable. Setting aside any stereotypes of Bernie Madoff and being immoral, it reminds me, we're about to publish a paper looking at the effects of sleep, caffeine, and alcohol use in financial traders, or abuse, I should say. Does caffeine provide an ability to salvage your otherwise sliding moral compass and behaviors so that when you are underslept, caffeine can bring you back level, as many people would say, well, okay, I just need to bang a few coffees and I'll be fine. I'll be just normal. Is caffeine your moral salvation under conditions of a lack of sleep?
There's a really neat paper by a good friend of mine, Dave Welsh, which picked up from my program research on the effects of sleep on unethical behavior. And exactly like you're saying right now, brought in this question of, can caffeine mitigate this effect? And so theirs was a study of short-term sleep deprivation and short-term forms of unethical behavior. And there might be different answers if we're talking about longer-term sleep deprivation, longer-term chronic unethical behavior. But what they did find is that giving people who were sleep deprived caffeine mitigated much of the effect of sleep deprivation on their self-control and their subsequent unethical behavior. So it does indicate that caffeine can help address some of this problem. I'm a little concerned at relying too heavily on that particular solution to that problem. We know that caffeine does not give you all of the benefits that sleep does. It's sort of a band-aid solution. So it can get you through this specific period of time with less of the performance-based decrements from sleep and looks like unethical effects from sleep deprivation as well. So there is some ability to help people become their better selves when they are sleep deprived by giving them a little bit of caffeine. I just don't want that to be used as license to say, oh, okay, problem
Mm.
solved. These people are really sleep deprived. Let's just put a bunch of pots of coffee around. Then we can just walk away because our jobs are done now. I think there are other problems that creates as well.
So we've spoken a lot about sleep and teams and the work culture. So I'll move on from that. I want to come on to a topic that I get asked so much about and probably have not done a good enough job of responding to, which is particular industries where shift work is especially common. And the challenges, the problematic difficulties with people struggling regarding their sleep and shift work and the cycling of that shift work. Perhaps since you're much more facile with this knowledge and better positioned, tell me a little bit about the sort of the typical problems and challenges that people suffer in terms of their sleep and their rhythms when they're doing shift work. And if there are any suggestions that you have or that you typically recommend for how to manage that, if it's at all manageable.
So when we talk about shift work, just so we're on the same page here, I think about shift work broadly, where we're talking about people who work outside of conventional, say, 9 to 5-ish schedules. So if they're working extra long shifts that then run into the evening, or they're working at times where most people tend to be asleep, those would all kind of fall under the umbrella of shift work. Oftentimes, shift workers also have sort of unstable schedules as well, where they work different shifts on different days or maybe different weeks. Prime examples of industries where shift work is common would be transportation and medicine. There are other industries where maybe there's heavy investments into capital equipment. And so in order to recoup some of that investment, you have the equipment running close to 24 hours a day, which means that a lot of factory workers also engage in shift work as well. I look at this from sort of two different angles. Ideally, we try to treat the problem first. And I understand that what I'm about to say is not possible in every situation. It's sort of like a menu, right? So you pick off the menu what works in your specific situation. But we always want to treat the problem first before we focus on treating the symptoms. So as an individual, you can try to get as much alignment as you can between your chronotype, your own circadian rhythm, and what your work schedule is. And a lot of times people would say, well, my bosses just tell me what time to come to work, and that's when I go to work. And I would say, okay, fair enough. That's not the context for this particular solution. In some contexts, there's some room for negotiation, especially over the course of a longer career, as far as what shifts do you work? When are you doing this work? And how do we maximize that fit with your own chronotype? So think through, when am I at my best? When do I need to sleep? And how can I get that to line up with my schedule? Another thing you can do is to manage the light in your life in order to sort of shift your circadian rhythms around. You can't really change your chronotype. So if you're a morning person, you're a lark. If you're a night person, you're an owl. That's the terminology we use in the literature. So you can't really turn a lark into an owl. You can force a lark to live like an owl, and they can kind of do it, but there are going to be some consequences for doing so. One thing you can kind of do is trick the lark's body into thinking that the time is different than it actually is, right? So you can have bright lights late at night, and that sends some physiological cues that, hey, this is daytime. And during the day, you can prevent exposure to light. And so that gives some signals to the body that this is nighttime. So you can change your lighting environment. And so exposing yourself to daylight, ideally, or blue light, otherwise, when you want to be alert and awake, especially like at the beginning of a work shift, the beginning of the time that you want to be awake, that's a great time to be exposed to natural light or blue light. And the opposite when it's at the end of your shift, or it's when it's time to wind down and go to sleep. So minimize exposure to light by keeping the lights low or off as much as possible. There are blue light filtering glasses, which can potentially be helpful for this. You just have to wear them at the right time, right, when you're trying to avoid exposure to light. And then we also have melatonin as another mechanism to shift circadian rhythms. So a lot of times people think of melatonin as like a sleep aid where if I take this pill, it'll knock me out. Call that a soporific. Melatonin is not a soporific. It regulates your circadian process. So you can intentionally alter, you can shift the timing of your circadian process if you use melatonin at the right time. And of course, doing so is a little tricky. You don't want to just figure that out on your own. Talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about. and they can help you figure out what is the right amount, what's the right time to use melatonin. So these are some things you can do to try to treat the underlying problem. You can also try to treat the symptoms, right? So you can manage your sleep environment to try to be especially sleep friendly. So you might be a night shift worker and then you're trying to get sleep during the day. So things like blackout curtains and maybe some earplugs and eye masks, these sorts of things. Manage the temperature of your room. You can think about eating strategies. One of the things we see in the research literature is that when people are engaged in shift work, they tend to eat worse food and they tend to eat at times of the day, which creates some downstream physiological problems like glucose dysregulation, which ultimately can result in diabetes. So we see lots of these diet related health problems with shift workers. And so managing that food environment with what food is around yourself, as well as what time you eat. And the short version there is it's best not to eat between, say, around 10 p.m. and maybe 6 or 7 in the morning. Those are hours of the day that are not physiologically well suited for processing food. So you can manage the timing of those foods and then try to keep healthy foods around you as well. Managing your non-work life is really important here as well. And I think about people, especially with small kids, and small kids are not always sympathetic to the demands of shift work schedules. So doing your best to manage that and expectations of spouses to try to get everyone on the same team to manage your sleep and your work and your family demands in a way that's as harmonious as possible, despite those very demanding contexts. We can also talk about two other ways to treat symptoms. There are other drugs you can use. And I always say that drugs should not be your first line of defense, but maybe one of the last ones. But we have caffeine, as we previously mentioned. And then we have some pills that help people go to sleep. So there's modafinil and armodafinil as examples that when I was in the Air Force Research Laboratory as a lieutenant.
And they're drugs that help people stay awake rather than help them fall asleep, modafinil.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where I was going. In the Air Force, they call them go pills and no go pills. And so there are contexts where if you fall asleep on the job, your plane is going to crash in the ocean. And so maybe using a go pill would be a responsible decision in that particular moment. And then no go pills would help you fall asleep when you're not on mission. And so I don't think we all have quite as high stakes jobs as maybe a fighter pilot or something like that. But I do think that in some specific context, there is space for go pills and no go pills under supervision of medical experts. And then, of course, we can treat other sleep disorders. The research literature is pretty clear here that sleep disorders and shift work do not play well together. Those problems add up in a magnified way. So if you're going to struggle with all the issues that come with shift work and misaligned circadian rhythms, you don't want to also be struggling with other sleep disorders like insomnia from other causes or breathing related sleep disorders or anything like that. So get those treated so that it's a little bit easier to fight the battles that you have to fight.
It's so interesting about the food component that you mentioned there. I wonder if that's one way that responsible employers could, if they have the means, help employees out who are doing shift work, which is they would, I presume, have to provide them some degree of access to food. Perhaps what they can do is offer more healthy related food options, because I could quite imagine that if you have to try to provide your employees food at a non ideal time throughout the night, you can take the easy route out and you can just stock whatever is available in terms of just fast food, processed food, all of the things that the sleep deprived brain craves most, rather than leafy greens, salad, nuts, etc. So, gosh, I'm going to try to recommend that next time I'm in a Fortune 500 company that has shift workers. We've spoken a lot about probably the negative, depressing things that happen when employees are not getting sufficient sleep. Let me change the tables to a more positive note, which is how do we make a change here? There's clearly a need for change if people have been listening so far. It's a pretty grim landscape out there regarding sleep insufficiency in the workplace. You've done some quite incredible work and you've gone inside of corporations and businesses and you've implemented well known sleep improvement strategies in the real world, which strategies that we know obviously will improve people's sleep. Where you took that was then to say, okay, if you invest in these, there is a palpable return on the investment of that sleep program in terms of the performance of your employees, or at least some of the outcome metrics that you would describe. Maybe I have that wrong, but tell me a little about some of the work that you've done in that more positive area.
Sure. So I guess first I'd like to say that the real solutions are macro level structural changes to the way we work, the way we prioritize work and sleep. And so if we could get some real movement on that end of the spectrum, that's the most powerful way to help people live healthy sleep lives and get the benefits that work that come with that. But secretly, my favorite interventions are on the other end of the scale. I kind of like the cheap and easy to implement solutions because I feel like we could get some short term progress on those. If we get some of that short term progress, then people will see the benefit and maybe we'll be more likely to get some of the long term, bigger, more powerful benefits from the more structural changes. I do have an ongoing program of research looking at these sort of cheap and easy solutions. And I like the idea that with these solutions, it's sort of win win, right? Where the employees get better sleep and the employers get better employees. So there's not much downside except the cost, which is relatively small. So the first of these projects was a paper I published with some colleagues in 2017, in which we just applied an existing tool to the work context. So in the world of insomnia, the first line of defense is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So the American Academy of Sleep Medicine says this is our first tool for addressing insomnia. Before we get to any medicine, pills, anything like that, we should use CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And there's even a digital version, probably a few different ones, where you can take this really powerful tool of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is really changing the way people think about sleep, changing their behaviors about sleep so that they can get the sleep they need. So we can take that, which is typically historically delivered in person, and they've now automated it. So you get this digital version of it. And there's some research to indicate that the digital version is essentially as effective as the live in-person version. What I like about the digital version is that it scales really well, right? You can scale that as many electrons as you need to scale it to treating as many people as you need for digital CBTI. And then because it is automated, the cost is considerably less. So in that particular paper, we used Sleepio, which is a platform that was developed by Colin Espy over at Oxford, and they've scaled up pretty well to National Health Services, some other organizations in England, and now they're starting to scale up in the US as well. So we said, okay, if digital cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia improves sleep, well, according to my program of research, we would expect it to also improve work outcomes. So that's exactly what we investigated. So we brought in a sample of employees who were suffering from insomnia, and we randomly assigned them to either a treatment condition where they got access to digital cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or they were in the waitlist control group. So they were also going to get the same treatment, but just not until after our study was over. So we got baseline measures from both groups, and then we captured another set of surveys 10 weeks later. And so over the course of those 10 weeks, the people in the treatment group were working through the digital cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And we found noticeable work improvements in mood and self-control, negative behaviors at work in the form of what we call organizational deviance. We found improvements in helping behavior directed towards cowork as well, improved job satisfaction. These are real world, tangible work outcomes that got better because we simply gave this relatively easy to access treatment to people who are suffering from insomnia. So I tell my MBA students, if you can invest $300 or whatever is the current retail price for that version of the treatment, if you can invest $300 into an employee and you get a better employee as a result, in most cases, there's going to be really great return on investment from that particular decision. Oftentimes we might invest 10 times, 100 times that amount of money into training to try to get a better employee. Treat their insomnia, we get a better employee.
I want to hear about the others, but one of the things I would love just to mention there too, and there was, I think, a great study that came out of Australia looking at the economic impact of a lack of sleep in businesses. It's, I think, often leaders and CEOs will say, what's the benefit of this? I think one of the things that that paper taught me was to say, don't just think about it as the benefit that sleep provides, the added value. Think about the cost that you save by way of instigating better sleep. Because when you have underslept employees, the utilization of healthcare is significantly more. The number of days that they take off being sick is also higher. The number of absenteeism days related to whatever seems to be higher. So it's not just that they're better when they come to work, but they're also less costly from a health perspective. And also, that employee is going to be there in the chair that you're paying them to be in for more of the time as well. So I love that idea that you can show individual business leaders there is this thing called a benefit. And by the way, relative to those other programs that you're spending money on, sleep is a pretty low hanging fruit that you're unaware of. The other supporter of this podcast is the electrolyte drink company called Element. Now, it's actually 4 letters, LMNT. I am a bit of an exercise fanatic, and I started buying their products some years ago, really, because of 2 key facts. First is the lack of sugar content. Element has no sugar. It also has no colorings, no artificial ingredients, which is unlike many of the other mixes out there that I was shopping. The second is because of the founders, who have some serious years of biochemistry experience under their belts, and they know what they're doing. So if you want to give it a try, just go to drinklmnt.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 8 free sample packs on any order that you place. Once again, that is drinklmnt.com/Matt Walker. There are other ways that you can augment sleep in the workplace that you've looked at. Tell me a little bit about those too.
In a follow-on paper, Cristiano Guarana and some other colleagues and I, we examined the effect of wearing blue light filtering glasses. In this study, this was a field experiment in which we had people spend a week or 2 in the treatment condition and also a week or 2 in the control condition. So each person is their own control group. So when they were in the treatment condition, they wore glasses that filter out blue light. And that's key because blue light is one of the mechanisms by which our circadian process says, hey, it looks like it's daytime. We should be up and awake. Let's not go to sleep just yet. So if we can filter out blue light, we're not getting that signal and it's easier for us to fall asleep. And again, regulate that circadian process. In the control condition, they wore glasses that had the same frames, but they had clear lenses. So we did our best to address potential placebo effects there. So across the course of the study, we found that wearing these glasses 2 hours before bedtime, right? So not all day long, you actually want blue light in the morning. Wearing these glasses 2 hours before bedtime led to improvements not only in sleep, but in work outcomes. So task performance went up, helping behavior went up, negative behaviors at work went down, work engagement went up. And what I think was especially cool in that particular set of studies was that study 2 in that paper was conducted with customer service representatives. And we were able to get customer service ratings from the customers themselves. And so we created an average customer rating score for a day for an employee, right? So if they had 20 customer service interactions, we would take the average of those 20 scores. That would be the score for that person for that day. And so we found that on the nights in which participants wore the blue light filtering glasses right before bed, the next day at work, they were rated as higher in customer service by the customers. And so those customers didn't have any idea there's any kind of study going on or what glasses anybody's wearing. So I see that as a pretty distal effect from the glasses themselves. We did find that the benefit of wearing the glasses got stronger over the course of the week. And I think that's consistent with the idea that the glasses are not just zonking you out. They're helping you to regulate your circadian process. And so they sort of glided in to a better sleep pattern across the course of a week rather than just instantly getting all the benefit.
Yeah, it's almost like a sleep medication or even going to the gym. You don't go to the gym once, which is the intervention, and then the next day you wake up looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's going to take some time to kick in, and that's fascinating and fits very well with circadian regulation, that it's a slower moving pace, not glacial. It only took a week, but fascinating.
Yeah. So those glasses, we had relatively fancy glasses from Swanwick that at the time retailed for like $90. I'm open to the idea that there are many different brands of blue light filtering glasses. Unfortunately, there's a lot of glasses out there that claim to filter out blue light and they don't actually filter out blue light. These ones, I've seen data to indicate that, in laboratory studies, these ones do work, and there are plenty others that work. I think If you put on the glasses and you can see blue, then the glasses are not doing their job. So anyway, those glasses that we used retailed for somewhere around $90 at the time we did the study. So again, I would say if you can invest $90 into an employee and you get a better employee out of it, that's really good ROI, return on investment, especially when you see better customer service ratings at the end of that chain. What kinds of training interventions and what expense of the training interventions are you doing to try to get that benefit? And maybe $90 for some glasses, or maybe less if you can find other ones that work, would be more effective. The latest paper of mine, which just came out this year, looked at a little bit higher tech version of an intervention where we looked at closed loop acoustic stimulation, which really just boils down to a headband that is intended to help people get into deeper sleep. So essentially what it does is it has measurements of EEG. So it's measuring the electrical activity of your brain. And I think of it like a child on a swing. So if you give the child a little nudge at the right time, you can get that child to swing with quite a large amplitude. So I have twins and they're 3.5. And so they like to swing together. And so I push them both at the same time. And so if I can give both of them the same nudge at the same time, then I can get them in sync. I can get their swinging back and forth to be in sync. So essentially what these headbands do is analogous to that, to synchronize the activity of a lot of the neurons in your cortex to get this stage N3 sleep, where if you look at the output of a machine measuring people's brainwaves during sleep, during that deepest non-REM sleep, that N3 sleep, you see waves of very high amplitude. So they're slow waves that are big. And so these headbands are nudging people towards that deeper sleep by synchronizing the firing of these neurons. So it's a fascinating program of research behind those headbands. I did not invent the headbands. I didn't even validate the effects of the headbands on sleep. All I did was say, okay, if that helps to improve sleep quality by getting people into deeper sleep, it should also improve work outcomes. And so we conducted a field experiment where we had people wear these headbands for a few weeks, and half the time the headbands were turned on and half the time they were muted. So they were doing everything, but without the sound that actually creates the synchronization. So there shouldn't be any effect in that condition, which they're muted. So that's the control condition. And we found a similar pattern of results as across the other studies. So for this one, we found better task performance, better work engagement, less negative behavior at work, more helping behavior towards each other when the headbands were in active mode than when they were muted. Unfortunately, the literature on closed loop acoustic simulation indicates that it works better for younger adults than it does for older adults. And we also found that to be the case in our study as well. And this was even with an age limit. I think we put a cap at 40 years old to even participate in the study. And within the range of ages that we had, there was still a very clear moderation effect. So we got the best effects on sleep and work outcomes for the adults who were youngest. And those who were the oldest within this sample, they had the weakest effects. But still, it's pretty encouraging to see that the headbands, these are a little bit more expensive, a little fancier. These particular ones, this is the Philips Deep Sleep headband, at the time retailed for $300. I've actually heard that they've discontinued this particular product, but for me, this is just a case of a category of products, right? So
Right.
there are a few other examples of closed loop acoustic stimulation headbands.
Yeah. And I should probably note as a disclaimer, just in case anyone notices it, speaking about startups, it is one of the startups that I have and it's active and ongoing. So we have developed a closed loop stimulation headband and it's now available to purchase. It's sort of first gen. And so we haven't done any corporate maneuvers yet to put it in the workplace, although I would love to do that and see if there are these similar benefits. But I do think what's lovely about this and your work is that you can essentially move it through the different strata levels from low-fi to hi-fi, from low tech to high tech, and from low friction to slightly higher friction. And no matter which of those you use, they are different, but the common theme is that they all do seem to instigate an improvement within the workplace and the employee, which is to say, here again, managers, bosses, CEOs, corporations, it's not a bad return on your investment.
Yeah, and I like the idea that the employee is benefiting by getting better sleep, which we know will lead to better health outcomes, but also the organization is benefiting because the employee is going to be doing better work. I would be sad if organizations said, okay, we know we have an environment which is creating lots of sleep problems. So let me throw a set of glasses at you. Let me throw this magic headband at you, and we'll get you access to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and then wash our hands of it and call it good. So I would hope that
Right.
this is the start of a long list of solutions, and that we'll get to some solutions that are more fundamental and larger scale, more structurally based. But I love the fact that we have some of these that are just cheap and easy to implement, and we could do these like right now.
So, Chris, drawing things to a close now, I want to think about these bigger picture messages that a corporation and employees can think about. If you were corporate czar for a day, how would you design the future of workplace interventions and policies in the context of sleep? And maybe in some ways that's an unfair question because we've already just spoken about these interventions, but above and beyond those, is there anything that we can do to also try to change this rampant culture of the sleep machismo? I'll sleep when I'm dead. And if you're not working 80 hours a week and sleeping just 3 hours a night in the workplace, you're not the employee for us. Is there anything else that you can think about as to how we want to change that conversation in drawing to a close?
So this fundamentally starts from we had to change our beliefs. I think drawing from the science, drawing from what we see, drawing from our own experiences, we had to realize that when we get the sleep that we need, we are better versions of ourselves. When we sleep deprive ourselves, we make ourselves worse versions of ourselves. And this applies to our employees, this applies to our bosses, this applies to everyone who is human in our workplace. And so, how do we want our employees to behave? How do we want them to act? How do we want to perform? Ties back into that. So, that should provide the motivation we need to start digging into some real solutions. And some of those would be the way we talk about sleep. So, I have a study on leader sleep devaluation, which also is backed up by another set of papers that's similar on sleep leadership. So the idea here is that leaders, they shape the context for sleep for all the people around them. And the more influential the leader, the more that's the case. And typically the most influential leader would be the CEO. They have the greatest impact on the culture and the norms of the organization. And so one thing that leaders can do is they can role model a lack of sleep. They can talk about how they're too important to sleep, how they're too busy to sleep. I'm the only one who's possibly smart enough to do all these tasks, and therefore I have to do all of them, which means I never have any time to sleep. And that's okay because I'm a genius who can handle all that. I'm super tough. So they create this context where, okay, that's the norm, that now other people feel like they need to live up to that. And they can further back this up by the way they treat people with regards to sleep and work. So maybe as the boss, I send an urgent email at 3 in the morning. Or maybe it's not even urgent, but I frame it as if it's urgent and as if I want a response at 3 in the morning. And then maybe someone responds at 3:03 in the morning. And the next day I say, hey, that was great. Let's see how dedicated you are by responding right away. And so by praising that behavior, I've increased the probability that we see more of that behavior. Oh, and I can do the opposite. I send that email at 3 in the morning and somebody doesn't respond until 8:50 in the morning. And so now I can make some snide comments at work about how, oh, I guess you're too important to respond to my emails. Got to get that sleep in, eh? Wish we all could sleep like that. I'm jealous of you. And make comments like that to sort of belittle someone
Yeah.
who is sleeping instead of working. So we can do that wrong or we can do it right. We can say that I want you to be your best self. I want to be my best self. So we need to prioritize sleep so that we can focus on the quality of our work and get the best outcomes for our organizations. Our goals are in alignment here. So from a big picture perspective, we have to start with that. And then we can focus on, okay, now what are the specific policies we can enact within the specific limitations of our context? Maybe in this context, we have to have some shift work. Okay, so within those constraints, what can we do to prevent some of these sleep issues and treat some of the symptoms like we talked about earlier? In other contexts, there's a totally different set of solutions. And it can work all the way down to these lower level solutions of access to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and maybe blue light filtering glasses, closed loop acoustic simulation. We should run that full gamut. And that's really how we will get movement with regards to sleep and better work outcomes as a result.
It's so interesting when you mention the responses that sometimes bosses will give when an employee says, yeah, I've actually been getting about 7.5, 8 hours of sleep, and they say, "Oh, well, I wish I could do that." When I sometimes hear people, they'll say, "Look," and they'll hush under their breath. They'll say, or you hear an interaction where someone says, "I'm just one of those people who needs, 8 or 9 hours of sleep," and the person sitting across from them usually says, "Really?" And there is an underlying connotation in that "really" statement, which is, "Huh, wow, are you not important? Are you not busy? Are you just lazy?" And I think that's the same notion here too.
If I can add a little cherry on top, there's a paper I have that's not quite fully through the publication chain yet, but which is about halfway there. But the evidence is quite clear in this paper. We talk about people essentially bragging about their sleep deprivation in the workplace. And so we find there's an interesting effect here on status that is a gendered effect. I think it might explain why people do some of this silly bragging about sleep deprivation. We find that when people brag about their sleep deprivation to their colleagues, it does potentially enhance their status at work, but it works differently for men than for women. So
Yeah.
when men brag about their sleep deprivation, they are seen as strong. So the implicit message here is, look, I am sleep deprived. I'm not at my best, but look how strong I am for being able to persist through that anyway and still be the great hero that you see before me. And so we see that for men, bragging about sleep deprivation leads to perceptions of strength, which increases their status. For women, we don't exactly flip that. It's just a slightly different story. So when women brag about their sleep deprivation, they are seen as self-sacrificing, that they are sacrificing their potential health and their well-being for the sake of the group. And so they gain status that way. And so this ties into literature on gender norms and what we expect people to do and all that. So essentially, people are, I think, trying to improve their status in the group by bragging about their sleep deprivation, and they are getting some benefit for doing so. They might actually improve their status. It's just that there are all these externalities that they're causing, right? When we all brag about our sleep deprivation, we now create a norm for sleep deprivation in our group. And now we all suffer for that norm having been created.
It's so fascinating, isn't it, that how you get almost this. I think it also happens in families in a parent to child direction, but here, bosses to employees transmission of sleep neglect, and it becomes contagious, and you become compliant or almost complicit in that insufficiency of sleep. Chris, you have been absolutely wonderful. I think anyone listening now will understand why this notion of less sleep equals more productivity is completely wrong. And it's in fact quite the opposite. That business leaders should think of sleep as probably the greatest form of venture capital that they could inject into the workforce. Thank you for spending this time with us, Chris. And again, we will link to all of Chris's websites, materials, and also his Twitter account. Follow him. He's fascinating. And I'm sure for any businesses out there who want to reach out to Chris to implement some of these, you will be able to find his contact details in the show notes. So, Chris, thank you so much again.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm happy to be here.